Recently, we visited Belize, and although we didn't have as much time to delve as deeply into the culture as I would have liked, we did have a few days to explore the place. Belize, a small nation nuzzled between the Caribbean Sea, Mexico and Guatemala, is one of the smallest nations in Central America and one of its newest, with a population well under 500,000 people. However, Belize isn't just unique for its size and age. Belize is unlike its neighbours for another reason: language. Unlike much of Central and South America, which were colonised by Europeans from Spain and Portugal, Belize was colonised by the British, bringing with them not only slaves and trade of their own, but also the English language. To find out more, I spoke to Osma Balam, a postdoctoral researcher and linguist who specialises in the languages of Belize. So I guess between themselves, Belizeans wouldn't really speak English unless there was no other common language. Would that be a good assumption?
Yeah. Yes. I think English, because of the colonial situation and because of its recent colonial history, English has never been a popular language. There are several studies that show that, for example, in the 70s, they would make fun of you if you spoke English. So English was always negatively perceived among Belizeans, especially in northern Belize. I think English is used only when there is not another option.
Yeah.
So it could be that you have to use English because you're addressing an English-speaking tourist, then you will speak English. But if that's not the case, more than likely you will use the national language, which is Creole, or you use your home language.
But what is a home language? For a small country, the number of languages spoken in Belize is actually quite varied, with speakers of English, Spanish and Belizean Creole making up the majority of speakers. To find out more about Creole in particular, I asked fellow Wikitongues volunteer and Creole expert Timothy to explain more about Creoles. So could you explain for anyone who has no idea what we're talking about here, what is a Creole language?
Okay, so it's actually kind of a difficult question to answer because a lot of people have different versions of what they would consider a Creole language to be. Oftentimes, if you look at an encyclopedia or even linguistic literature, you'll come up with a kind of outdated definition that says that a Creole is a language that results from contact between two or more different languages, and generally the initial stage is what's called a pidgin language. So in order to communicate with each other, different speech communities will come up with a pidgin, which isn't really a full-fledged language. It's more like a code that includes vocabulary, but nothing very grammatically complex. Out of a pidgin language, when a community of children grow up hearing a pidgin in their community, then they will adopt it as a first language and sort of fill in the gaps, and within a generation it turns into a full-fledged language, which is considered a Creole. I, however, do not agree with this definition. Basically, what I've come to conclude is that Creole is just a label that indicates a sort of socio-historical context. So what I would call a Creole language is basically a language that results from different speech communities coming into contact with each other, usually through a situation of colonization. And the result is that you get a language that has different characteristics and aspects of various parent languages. The vocabulary is going to be very similar. Creole languages have the lexicon of the language of the colonizer, but are often syntactically and semantically functioning based on other languages. In the case of a lot of Caribbean Creoles, West African languages have a really strong influence. You won't recognize it in most of the words themselves, but if you look at the structure and the grammar, then you'll start to see similarities with West African language families. So yeah, it sort of creates the situation where you sort of think you understand, maybe you have some idea, but also you're aware that you're definitely missing something. So.
But how similar are these Creole languages to the languages they've developed from? This almost false friend of understanding Belizean Creole is something I really noticed in my time in the country, and being such a language enthusiast, I was desperate to know more. But I couldn't help to think, was it appropriate to ask? Is it more polite when you're in a Creole-speaking area to try and speak in the Creole language, or to use a lingua franca like Spanish or English or French, depending on what it is in that area?
I think you have to be aware of the fact that the person you're speaking to is probably not going to assume that you know anything about their language that you even respect their language. I would say what's important is to kind of gauge the situation and the individual's take on it, and to not really push it. The colonialism isn't over. And as a visitor, as a tourist to a lot of, say, countries in the Caribbean where Creole languages are spoken, you're sort of the new colonist. And so for me, it's always important to make sure that I'm actually invited into using the language. Okay. And if I'm not, I completely understand, and I'm not going to push it,
It can be hard for foreigners to learn or even get in on the conversation about a language that is associated with imperialism, especially because language is so closely associated with identity. But just as Belizean Creole is more than just a morphed version of English, Belize is so much more than just Creole. To find out more, I spoke to Ozma.
Well, Belize is a very linguistically diverse. So many languages are spoken in Belize, and it's basically depending on the region. If you're from the north, then obviously you will be trilingual, meaning you will speak Spanish, English, and Creole. If you live in the south, trilingualism will be different. More than likely you will speak Creole, English, and probably Garifuna or another Mayan language. But in general, most Belizeans are multilingual. So all of them speak at least 2 languages, but it's the norm to be trilingual.
So trilingualism is the norm. Okay, that's really interesting. As Ozma said, being trilingual in Belize is the norm, with Belizeans able to communicate in English, Spanish, Garifuna, Creole, and a whole host of other languages, with speakers and languages of different communities and countries influencing how languages are used and spoken in and around Belize to this day. It's like language doesn't care about borders, does it? It's the influence. It doesn't matter if the country ends here, the language doesn't necessarily, I guess.
One of the important things about Belize is that it celebrates its linguistic diversity. The national language is in the classroom to facilitate acquisition or learning of English. And so very often in schools you will see that materials or books or stories, they often incorporate collections of short stories that are written by Belizeans. They usually reflect that aspect of Belizean culture, its linguistic diversity.
Is that true for every language spoken in Belize, that there's this kind of national respect and kind of work towards linguistic diversity?
Yes, I think in general, I think it has been inevitable, I think, because we have to consider that, for example, in the case of Belize, it became independent only recently in 1981. So I think because of its recent colonial past, I think the country is still in a process of discovering or establishing its national identity, especially because even though English is the official language of Belize, it's usually a second language for most speakers.
So if English is simply the official language of Belize, acting as a lingua franca within the country, a means to an end when it comes to communication, does that mean that there's more pride within their own Creole language? Or, with English already acting as the lingua franca and being a huge language when it comes to globalization, does that mean that Creole and other languages in Belize have less of a place in an already interconnected world? Is there a feeling in Creole-speaking areas that their Creole language doesn't have a place or shouldn't be taught?
It's not uncommon. It's not uncommon at all, unfortunately, yeah. Linguistically, in linguistic literature, Creoles have always sort of been labeled kind of linguistic orphans, sort of an anomaly. And I think it's important not only to raise the status of Creole languages, but also to have people learn the history of their own language and see that it is actually connected to the linguistic fabric of the world, and it's no different from any other language. And
it's hard to predict the future of a Creole language. With globalization and an ever-increasing use of English in Belize, Creole could soon find itself lost to English and Spanish in the country. So is it our role to protect these languages? The answer isn't a simple one, and it's much bigger than I could ever do justice in such a short video. So I'm going to leave you with a version of something that a viewer of a past episode of Language Stories recently told me. We can't jump in and save languages. That's not our role, to step in front of speakers of their own language. Instead, we can act as allies, standing beside and behind, supporting our fellow humans to keep the languages that hold their culture dear. Thanks for watching Language Stories. If you have a language story that you'd love to share, then get in touch. Details are in the description below. We're currently looking out for Series 2, which will be all about Southeast Asia. So if you think you can contribute to the story, let me know. And as always, remember to subscribe for regular language learning videos. I will see you very soon. Thank you. Bye.